Now, for this next session here, we've got a panel on, well, a topic that a lot of people in the world have been thinking about, especially after the events of last year. And that, of course, is AI, artificial intelligence. And we want to explore in this panel, well, how AI is going to impact cybersecurity leadership, and the landscape overall. So I'm very excited to have here an expert set of 3 different panelists. I want to thank Lee, Caroline, and Sunil for joining here. And I'm going to go ahead and let you guys each introduce yourselves. And we're going to go in the order that we see here on the slide. So Lee, can you go ahead and kick us off, please?
Hey, Frank, thank you. I'm glad to be here today. And my name is Lee Kim. I'm a cybersecurity professional working for a nonprofit and also a consultant. And I'm an attorney by background. So I suppose that's why I was brought in here, in addition to being a person with a former IT systems tech background. I also work with members of Congress and other members of Parliament around the world in terms of legislation and regulation as well, so I can offer that perspective. Thank you.
Hey, Lee, I got to say, before we go on to let the other speakers introduce themselves, Lee, hey, you undersold yourself there a little bit. Hey, you work for one of the most influential nonprofits, HIMSS, in the healthcare space. You've got a very interesting background that you hinted at in terms of starting your career as a systems and database administrator. And but then, hey, also got your law degree and have your JD and have been invited by governments, as you said, parliaments around the world to come and give your expertise on cybersecurity, privacy, and legal matters. So, hey, that's why you're here, Lee. So yeah, thank you for joining. So yeah, maybe I should have done the intros, but Caroline, we'll go to you and see if I need to enhance your intro here as well.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you for having me here. I'm honored and humbled to be on this panel. My name is Caroline McCaffrey. I am a data privacy and cybersecurity attorney. I'm actually also an attorney by background. Currently, I am the CEO and co-founder of ClearOps, which is a data privacy and cybersecurity platform. And we are incorporating generative AI, which I think is part of the reason that I am here. So I'm an entrepreneur, lawyer, and love talking about artificial intelligence and new technology. Thank you for having me.
That was very good. So I don't really have too much more to add, other than the fact that, hey, you are personally a 2-time victim of tax fraud and have seen firsthand the implications of, well, poor privacy and security practices. So thank you for being here, Caroline.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, Sunil.
Oh, well, having 2 lawyers here, I guess you need a doctor. But I'm not a doctor. I'm actually an engineer. But I think because of my prior role, people assume I have a doctorate. I don't. I used to be the chief security scientist at Bank of America. And then I spent a year at YLVentures doing what Frank is doing now as a CISO-in-Residence. And I'm currently the CISO at Jupiter One.
Awesome. Well, hey, Sunil also perhaps undersold himself a little bit here. Hey, Sunil also was in various roles prior to what he just mentioned, was the chief security scientist at Bank of America. He's also the author of a book that, hey, I will say it took longer to publish than I would have liked. I was waiting some years to actually read it, but published the book, the Cyber Defense Matrix, and also created the DIE Triad, which are 2 tools that are helping us as security leaders and the industry overall kind of think about and frame the security landscape, the sometimes complex security landscape. So, hey, we've got an awesome set of panelists here to talk, well, yes, about AI. And one of the things that we want to do here, we talked about this in the prep session ahead of this panel, we've got a large audience here. And I think that people are going to be coming from different backgrounds in terms of kind of familiarity with AI, familiarity with machine learning, and so on. Kind of want to start with some foundations, some first principles, if you will, in terms of framing AI here on the next slide, in terms of kind of the evolution of computing. And as you can see, starting all the way back from the mainframe, and if we look at this, it's not so much that new technologies go away. We still, of course, have mainframes. We still, of course, have PCs. It's that new technologies, as they come about, well, they kind of exceed, they supersede, they enhance the capabilities of what comes before it in terms of kind of the size, in terms of the scope, in terms of the impact, and in terms of those various capabilities. And if you look at the second to last bottom row here, we've got mobile. And we mark the state of mobile, the beginning of the modern mobile era in 2007. And of course, many of you probably know that we say 2007 because that was when the iPhone was introduced, the defining modern touchscreen smartphone. Now note at the very bottom row here, we've also got AI, artificial intelligence. This is something that has been researched and thought about along with machine learning for a long time. So it's not that it just started in 2022, but we mentioned 2022 here because in November of 2022 is when ChatGPT took the world by storm. And you can see here in terms of the size of various systems and devices, ranging from 100,000 mainframes all the way up to billions of mobile devices in use today. Well, how is AI going to be a little bit different? Well, I would argue that, hey, it has the possibility to become ubiquitous, right? AI is potentially going to be everywhere. Now, Sunil, I want to ask the first question to you, if you can help us frame kind of this landscape a little bit, just from kind of the basics here, since we've got a very large audience. Can you give a little bit of a brief overview of kind of AI, if you will, the various acronyms? We've got AI, ML, LLMs, large language models, generative AI. How would you quickly, hey, putting you on the spot here, quickly summarize, what people need to know is some of these basics before we start talking about the security threats and risks?
Wow, okay. Unpacking all that in only a few minutes, like 60 seconds would be pretty hard. I would actually suggest if folks really want to get a really good thesis on AI and where we are today, there's a short 30, maybe 20-minute video from DARPA. And DARPA, as you may imagine, is a pretty good authority on AI. And they articulate what they call 3 waves of AI. The first one is based on essentially expert learning, expert knowledge type of systems. The second one, which is based on statistical techniques, and the third one being one where effectively we reach this stage of artificial general intelligence. We are in the second stage today, statistical machine learning type of techniques. And with it comes a number of flaws and caveats and pitfalls. And those are the things that we need to absolutely be aware of as leaders. There is this third wave that many are either eagerly anticipating or dreading, and we are not there today, despite many claims that you may hear. But the DARPA framework, actually, I think, provides one of the best frameworks I've seen in terms of just understanding where we are today and where the shortfalls are for the current generation of AI.
Perfect. Thank you for that recommendation. And moving on here to the next slide, if we talk about the evolution of computing here a little bit, organizations, your organizations, businesses are not implementing and deploying these technologies, of course, just for the sake of deploying technology. In this illustrative example here, we see a fictional business, if you will, that has adopted these various technologies over time. And as you can see towards the upper right-hand side, we've got artificial intelligence here. Now, next question for Caroline here, given your experience and familiarity and use of generative AI in various organizations, try to make it a little bit more concrete, a little bit more practical. Caroline, can you talk a little bit about the differences between the different offerings that we see on the marketplace today, maybe from OpenAI, from Microsoft? What are organizations thinking about in terms of usage and integration of these large language models?
Yeah, sure. So I've done quite a bit of work on the different type of technologies from, like you said, OpenAI, Microsoft, Google Bard. I've looked at GitHub's Copilot, and the speed at which things are being launched is quite amazing. We have AutoGPT, we have all sorts of other companies that are building on top of these models that were released. And when we talk about the models, we're talking about, in this case, the LLM, the large language models that were put together by these different companies. And what I'm seeing is that there's a large differentiation going on between them in terms of, for example, Microsoft is focusing on their data privacy and cybersecurity practices as the differentiator between them and some of the other companies that are releasing generative AI types of tools. And then also, even within, for example, OpenAI, there's a difference between ChatGPT, which is a consumer app, or DALL-E, which is a consumer app, versus GPT 3, 3.5, 4, and as we know, they're working on the next iteration of that. And and how the APIs that go along with those different types of models. There's embedding models, there's other types of models that are being released or have been released by OpenAI. And so the terms that you get based on how you're using them, whether you're a consumer consuming a ChatGPT, entering a prompt and getting a response and output, versus someone who is a developer connecting in APIs to these different systems. So there's a lot going on. Google Bard was an amazing sort of release because it had real-time search data that was being incorporated into it. And then, of course, last week, OpenAI released basically the same thing with the power of, I believe it was Microsoft. So really interesting times, lots to go into. I'll leave it at that because I could literally talk about that and answer your question for the entire time we have here.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that background, Caroline. And, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Lee now. And, this is to start with Lee, but then open it up for anybody else here. And just a friendly reminder, if anybody here online has a question at any time, feel free to go ahead and post it into Slack. But Lee, from a business adoption perspective, there are some questions that arise in terms of ethics and safety and kind of AI safety versus cyber safety. Can you chime in a little bit about kind of what the thinking is around that?
Definitely. In fact, Blumenthal had a congressional hearing on this last Tuesday to speak exactly on that topic before the Judiciary Committee of the Senate. And that said, we know that generally as to these LLMs that we've mentioned, such as Bard, such as OpenAI's ChatGPT and others, they do have safety controls built in that. And certainly they are by and large programs so that there are content filters to prevent, let's say, illegal or discriminatory or harmful content from being generated by these platforms. And what's more, there are engineers behind the scenes that look at the inputs as they're, after they're done and what was generated out to ensure that these safety mechanisms are reinforced in a positive way. And they also heavily rely on, may I add, user input as well. For example, with OpenAI's ChatGPT and with others, you could give a thumbs up or you can communicate with it saying that was a great response. If so, that's positive reinforcement, much like psychologists do in terms of working with people in terms of dynamics and relationships and are things going well or not well. That's just simply part of a tool to ensure that the data that is being given back is quality data and it's not really harming people. On the other hand, I could say that, of course, before there was oversight by, let's say, the European data protection authorities, right? We saw less control on the privacy perspective as to what users can do. For example, as a result of the Italian data protection regulator, the previous month, we finally have an option in ChatGPT where you can ask it to turn off conversations so that whatever you input will not be incorporated into the quote unquote algorithm, as it were, and so that you could still continue to use it, but not worry so much about your personally identifying information being incorporated into the model. Notwithstanding that, one knows, though, that it still goes somewhere, and that is to OpenAI. So there is certainly the distinct possibility that engineers from a QC perspective can look at various inputs that you do have within that 30-day time period that OpenAI has to ensure that it's appropriate and within guidelines. But I suspect that we need more oversight, and that's certainly something that during that Blumenthal hearing last Tuesday, we certainly heard a representative from IBM, for example, calling for, actually.
Great. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Lee. And, you mentioned various country or organizations banning or restricting the use of ChatGPT as an example. And that is actually directly related to what we see here. An organization adopts these technologies to meet various business goals. It winds up increasing the operational risk for the organization. But at the same time, the threat landscape here is changing as well. And that is actually related directly to a couple questions that came in the chat. Robson asked, what about companies banning ChatGPT related to sensitive code leak, sensitive data leak? Kristen asks, hey, and I'll direct this to Sunil to start. Hey, is there a way to begin to measure the risks of AI in an organization related to this threat landscape, like frameworks, threat lists, risk scorecards, and so on? And of course, one of these things, being intellectual property theft or loss, as was mentioned. Sunil, can you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I want to unpack a number of things. I'd like to try to also comment on some of the things that were said previously. So Lee mentioned a couple things that is really important for us to consider as leaders in the cybersecurity space. She used the word safety. And I don't think we understand universally what that word means, especially in relation to security. And if we were to take a step back and just say, okay, what is that? Why are we using that word? I would say for the most part, we in the practice of cybersecurity actually practice more cyber safety than cyber security. What's the difference? Well, let's add the word food in front of safety. What is food safety? Hygiene, compliance, inspections, those sorts of things. And if you think about it, most of what we do in security is dominated by what we actually should be calling cyber safety. If you're wondering what cyber security then is, you add the word food in front of it again, and you're now dealing with things like starvation and the absence of baby formula and Ukrainian wheat and all these other things that the world definitely cares about, but it's somewhat abstracted. Okay, and the reason why I think this is important for us to consider, and maybe even think about how we look at our practices more in the under the auspices of safety, is because the number one concern that we're going to have with artificial intelligence is not whether or not we send corporate data into OpenAI and whatnot, but rather AI safety issues altogether. Okay, and AI safety issues is what is the main predominant concern amongst AI researchers. If you remember the pause on further development of models more powerful than GPT-4, it's because of AI safety issues. And the reason why I make this statement is because we as practitioners, we want to be ready for the next thing, right? We want to anticipate what's coming up and to be able to address really potentially bigger concerns than just cybersecurity concerns. And I would argue, who better than a set of people who are steeped in cyber safety concerns than those? I mean, if we need we're going to need a lot of people who understand AI safety, and who better than, again, a set of people who understand cyber safety concerns? Okay, with that said, let me also then say, look, one of the things that cyber security people are really good at is fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And we communicate that, unfortunately, almost to the point, well, we communicate it because we don't feel like it's getting the sufficient amount of attention, right? We need budget, we need people. And what is one great way to do that? You throw a bunch of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and somehow money appears. And unfortunately, I think that's happening right now with AI as well. Trust me, there are true concerns with AI security. AI safety, I should say. But some of the concerns that I've heard are really misguided. And I'll use the example around the questions of how do we block these AI platforms? Well, what is it that we're concerned about? Well, one of the concerns, of course, is that we put into some of these systems our intellectual property, and that intellectual property that we put in somehow gets regurgitated back to somebody else who asks a similar question or whatever else it might be. So we put in our code, and somehow Samsung puts in its code, and somehow Apple gets it, or Apple puts in its code, and somehow Samsung gets it. There's a misunderstanding of how these systems work that leads to that sort of belief. This is not to say that, for example, as Lee mentioned, a OpenAI engineer being able to read the input that someone put in, but it is not. We should not be promulgating this belief that the data will be regurgitated to another OpenAI customer. And so these sort of things we need to be mindful of as leaders. We need to think about how do we position ourselves for the bigger problem that's going to emerge around AI safety. And how do we clear up some of the uncertainty and doubt and the fear that we see around the use of AI tools that we see that really actually help accelerate the business and help us become more competitive in the grand scheme of things.
So Neil, thanks a lot for that. Those comments that directly kind of responds to one of the
I
attendees.
should
Kurt.
I should
Go
also
ahead.
mention your graph here. I think one other thing to throw out here is that you have I don't know if the scale is meant to be logarithmic, but if it isn't logarithmic, I think it might be skewed because the y-axis should be logarithmic. These are things that are like growing exponentially and not in this linear fashion. And I would also question whether the business side is below the threat side. I think the business always moves first and even faster than attackers if we allow them.
Yeah, that's well, a number of things there. So yeah, appreciate those comments. And Kurt specifically asked about kind of the security taking a little bit more of a doomsday science fiction approach and that fear, that uncertainty and doubt that you mentioned. So thanks for directly addressing his comment. And hey, in terms of kind of the lines, which one should go above the others, there's an interesting conversation in terms of kind of the business. At the organizations that I've been a part of, I've kind of seen kind of be laggards a little bit in terms of kind of adoption. And I know, Lee, you mentioned something along those lines in a prior conversation. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Thanks, Frank. So, in terms of where an entity is given technology's advancements and the relevant threats associated with that versus where the business is, in some ways, one can say that it's relevant to the critical infrastructure sector. For example, I come from the healthcare sector, and I think that it's definitely a myth that all healthcare organizations are behind the curve. However, because it is so incredibly complex in terms of the hundreds, if not thousands, of people and entities that we have to share data each day, which makes security very difficult, we are drowning essentially in terms of threats. And I think another sector which certainly is a bit of a quote unquote laggard is just because, again, analogously in the university context where research is prized as well as academic freedom, I think that IT security teams there are hesitant to lock down security so much because there are other considerations at play as well. So I think it depends upon industry. I think it depends, of course, upon culture. Take a hospital system, for example. I can assure you that there probably isn't any cybersecurity professional working for a hospital who has not received a demand from at least one doctor that has demanded greater access because they are who they are, and we know who has power within these institutions. So just some insights there.
Thank you. Good example. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the very last slide here that we've got just to kind of frame the discussion into 3 bucket points. And some of these topics we've kind of touched on already here in terms of, hey, what are the security considerations for the usage of these AI services? And that was evidenced by the pause in Italy of ChatGPT and other states adopting kind of similar approaches. We've also got the development of AI models themselves. We've talked about these foundational models like from OpenAI or Microsoft and others, but there's the rise in local models that are going to be used by various enterprises. And then, of course, the integration of various AI capabilities, perhaps into existing applications and workflows. But let's go ahead and start with the usage. And I want to go ahead and turn it back over to Caroline here in relation to policy. And usually when there's a new technology development, sometimes organizations, CISOs will work towards rushing to get some sort of acceptable use policy for AI in place, some issue-specific policy. But Caroline, kind of based on what you've seen with AI, what's the difference? What's the same in terms of what we should be considering from a policy perspective?
Sure. So, I mean, I think usage of AI could probably fit already into an acceptable use policy that your organization already has, and potentially even a data classification policy that your organization already has. I think I was looking at the comments or the questions in the Slack channel, and I think everyone here understands that AI is based off of data. Like I remember when I worked at Clarify back in 2015, 2016, there was this understanding that AI may have, before that, may have died. And then big data came, and sort of your slide before, big data came around, and all of a sudden there was this a massive amounts of data, which is what is required to feed the AI models. And so it's not surprising that after the big data era, we get now the AI era, so to speak, if I can coin that. So the usage of it, a lot of companies are putting in place policies. The Samsung incident created a lot of new other companies to put in policies like the bans. I think it's important for us to, when you're drafting a policy, I've actually written about this. When you're drafting a policy, it's important to understand how it connects to your other policies within the company. Like I said, your acceptable use, your data classification, but then also looking at the specific AI that you're trying to govern. So the policies I have been helping companies with is the generative AI policies, specifically targeting generative AI technology, since this has become quite popular with the use of ChatGPT and now Bard and Microsoft's ChatGPT and several other chat models. I think what's kind of funny is that we went from really looking at chatbots as something that was sort of annoying and really bad to all of a sudden now we see them as something pretty cool and really great to use. But the terms of use, it's amazing to me as an attorney that we finally got to a point where actually reviewing terms of use and privacy policies has become critical before we allow our companies to use these types of technologies. I'll stop there. Like I said, I can keep going forever, so I'll stop.
Great. Lee, I saw you nodding there as well. You want to chime in?
Yeah, I think that policies are definitely paramount. I mean, I see a lot of CISOs trying to figure out how to responsibly implement, what's a safe practice in terms of using AI within our organizations. How do we prevent data leaks, et cetera, et cetera. And I feel that there are just so many mobile apps, so many web extensions, so many applications. So it's, even though CISOs do hesitate to work with, let's say, in-house counsel or outside counsel is appropriate to stand up policies, I really think that legal counsel should be brought in at an earlier stage as the AI program within the organization is being stood up, because not only is it a security issue, but of course it's an enterprise-wide business impacting, workforce impacting issue that needs to be evaluated from all angles, not just IP, but also as to employment. As an example, I was just looking at an AI database with publicly reported news in terms of how AI has been used in sort of extreme ways. And according to a news source, allegedly there was a worker in China who was let go because the AI implemented program said, you are at risk of resigning, therefore, wherefore, before you actually resign, we're going to recommend to HR you get fired. And that's what happened. So there are all kinds of, I think, legal issues to think about, not just data privacy or cyber, but I would contend things relevant to employment law and other things that are part of this nucleus to think about. But it all relates at the end of the day to risk and also to the people aspect too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, earlier I mentioned the 3 waves of AI, and one of those key differences between the second and the third is a reasoning capability, or at least the ability to explain a decision that's made. The problem with a lot of the systems that we have is they're unexplainable. And so if I make a lending decision, if I make a hiring-firing decision and it's not explainable, then I should be or if I turn to an algorithm and say, well, it's the algorithm that told me to do that, it's not very defensible, and it's certainly not explainable to anybody who is on the negative end of that decision. So GDPR and a number of other regulations have put forth this right to explainability, which unfortunately right now is not really explainable. And if you think about the hallucination problem that we've all heard about, it's a situation where the machine's not able to explain because it doesn't have the clear understanding of causal effect. There's a well-known case of this girl who was undergoing brain surgery, open brain surgery, and the surgeon stimulated some part of her brain, and then and she started to laugh. And so the doctor asked her, well, why did you laugh? Now, we know the answer because we know exactly the causal effect, but she would hallucinate a series of answers. And she would say, oh, it's because what you're wearing is funny, or it's because some picture on the wall is funny. Anyway, the point being, the causal effect of these systems is actually not really explainable today. And that's going to be a hindrance and a legal barrier for a lot of these things. Let me also offer one other perspective, and when it comes to the use of these systems, and again, how we can think of ourselves in this leadership role. What if, for example, so a lot of concerns are around the loss of intellectual property to providers like OpenAI and whatnot. But what if intellectual property is a form of currency, and we have to spend that currency to make more currency? We have to spend money to make more money. The intellectual property is that currency. And we, as cybersecurity leaders, we become the equivalent of a CFO for intellectual property. We don't make the intellectual property. The CFO doesn't make money. But we have a fiduciary responsibility for the wise use of this new form of currency. And in that regard, we want to, if I didn't want to lose any money, I might just hoard it and not let anybody, spend any of that intellectual property. If I'm a really bad CFO, I'm going to say, no, you can't spend on anything, right? But the company's not going to make any money. It's not going to grow. It's not going to advance in any meaningful way. And I think it's going to be a similar situation for our intellectual property too. That which you think is your most valuable intellectual property today, could you actually generate much more valuable intellectual property if you allow some of these technologies to do its best on top of it, right? Could you actually make a better program? Can you make a better PowerPoint? Can you communicate more effectively? One of the things that I think is really revolutionary with things like ChatGPT is not the fact that it can produce really interesting prose and whatnot. It's actually the broad dissemination of our know-how. Today, I believe that William Gibson has this quote, "The future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed." How we build secure systems is known. It's already known somewhere, but it's just not evenly distributed. Might there be some kind of system that helps evenly distribute that, if we can ask the right questions and if we can frame it properly? And I think that's really the opportunity for us as leaders, to look at ourselves as a CFO for intellectual property, to find ways that we can disseminate this know-how and be able to tap into that as quickly as possible. And I think there's a lot of opportunity in doing that.
So Neil, you always have the best analogies, the CFO for intellectual property. That's right on. Related to that, I want to go over back to Caroline here. Is Bradley asked, hey, what are the legal considerations, related to what Sunil was mentioning here in terms of kind of training LLMs on your existing intellectual property or copyrighted material? We've seen some examples of this with Getty Images, for example, filing a lawsuit of the use of their images in image generation systems, perhaps like a Midjourney and a DALL-E and so on. But yeah, Caroline, what are those legal considerations for training the LLMs on copyrighted material?
Training the LLMs on copyrighted material. So I think, and I saw this also in the questions, when you look at GitHub's Copilot, they trained, as far as I know, actually they used OpenAI models to train the code generating platform on open sourced code. So a lot of people think of open source as freely available, but open source is subject to licenses, and you have very different licenses that may come into play. You may have what they call copyleft or copyright licenses. For example, when I was general counsel at my companies, I would say to them, in terms of open source licenses that were permitted to be used, I really liked the Apache license. And there were certain reasons that I would give to them. So that was sort of hey, developers, anything that uses that license, go for it. If it's a different license, I need to review. I need to review that open source license before we integrate it into our tool stack. I think when you're talking about the use of AI in coding, the same questions arise around what is the open source license that was attached to that code. Images is a whole nother discussion as well, because images, as we all know, are also subject to copyright licenses. What we're seeing in the Supreme Court in some of the cases on fair use have a very significant impact in this particular area. But to go back to the Copilot and the open source licenses, the copyrights, one of the things that AI can do and that can be developed in these models is the attribution. You can have the model return the code with the corresponding license. It just hasn't been done. And that is what I think is a victim of the speed at which we are moving. And it's a legal insecurity. And I'm going to say that specifically here on this panel about how attribution absolutely should have been something that the model could return as part of its outputs, whether we're talking about OpenAI, Copilot, BART, any of them, Microsoft. There is custom models that can be built on top of the LLMs that also have different security parameters around it. We can talk about that, but I just want to emphasize on that one point, which is the insecurity here is that some of the legal facts that should be attached to the outputs were not done. And I think we will see some changes, and hopefully those will happen pretty fast to catch up with that.
Yeah, Carolyn, so this is something that I've been wrestling with as well, to understand to the limit to which attribution could be made. Now, I think it's easy to say, for example, this came from Wikipedia, this came from some general source. But consider, think about it from the standpoint of a research paper. So when someone writes a research paper, of course we want it to be well documented and to have references and whatnot. But consider now, what if, okay, so let's take that research paper, and not every paragraph, not every word, not every sentence is footnoted, right? Mm-hmm. It's only certain parts that are footnoted. And the writer makes the decision to say, well, this part I think is really largely drawn from this source, and therefore I'm going to footnote just that part, right? But consider now the sources that are going into what some of these generative AI capabilities are doing. It's drawing from so many sources that it's hard to say, well, what source? What is that one singular source that it's coming from? Now, you could argue, well, if it's the bulk of it's coming from, let's say, this form of artist, because maybe the prompt asks for this form of artist, or it's coming from if the bulk of it's coming from a particular source, we should perhaps say this is where it's coming from. But the problem is that we don't just think about the nature of footnoting every word, every sentence, every paragraph in a research paper. We don't do that today. But effectively, the mechanisms that are being used to draw, to create this, that's exactly what is happening. It's coming from so many different sources that being able to singularly define, here's the source that I came from, is extraordinarily hard from a technical standpoint.
Yeah, let me go ahead and give Lee an opportunity to chime in here.
Sure. Thanks, Frank. So I wanted to say that in terms of the copyright law in the U.S., there's, aside from VARA, which is for visual artists producing artwork of a certain number of limited copies, we actually don't have the requirement of attribution as it relates to copyrights here in the United States. That's a frequent myth. But of course, in Europe, though, they do have something known as moral rights. And that, of course, is a requirement there to attribute as to source. Notwithstanding that, I wanted to unpack a few terms that were talked about previously here. And that's to say that in terms of copyrights, the good thing to know is wherever you are around the world, we have about 6 treaties that essentially require the signatories of various countries to have implementing laws that establish minimum rights And those 6 treaties are specific as to copyright, such as the WIPO copyright treaty, such as the Berne Convention, things like that. So that's why it's important to know that as a result of these international treaties and what is now international law, even though respective countries have their own laws to some varying degrees, is that the danger of copyright is that you actually don't need that copyright notice affixed to the original work of expression in order for it to be copyrighted. But you might also say, okay, so this might be copyrighted, whether it's a piece of software code, whether it's an image, whether it's even a derivative work based upon something, or maybe even a translation of work. That's also copyrighted universally around the world, and that's recognized. But I think that we have to also understand that this concept of fair use, which if you are dragged into court for a copyright infringement, it is an affirmative defense. In the US, we have 4 factors, but each jurisdiction weighs the 4 factors differently. Sunil, to get to your point, yes, it's true. You can sometimes have a copyright infringement where it's essentially a facsimile of the content of what an author created, and of course that's infringing. But the courts tend to frown upon commercial use of a work or taking the heart of a work, even if it might be 1% or 10%, and that could be infringing. So there's no hard and fast rule, unfortunately, but I predict that quite possibly in the next 5 to 10 years, we might actually have a revision to our, let's say, the Berne Convention or the WIPO copyright treaty or one of those things as it relates to AI, because it just really puts us in another world in terms of what is fair use, what's not, and what are the guide rails essentially around that. And I also predict that part of this too is, I think as AI technology is mature, even though we know now that generative AI works by way of statistical, this is the prediction about the words that come next, and this may make sense based upon X, Y, or Z. I really do believe that there may be contextual containers in the future where the AI will, at least in part, have a light understanding of what it's talking about, what it's analyzing, what it's actually synthesizing, so that it isn't the wild, wild west of my being able to, let's say, enter in a prompt into Midjourney or DALL-E or other things and to say, I want this likeness of a celebrity or something else and to be doing X, Y, or Z. But, are we necessarily thinking, though, about things relevant to the right of publicity, which, by the way, intersects with the First Amendment, as does copyright? So essentially, the reason why fair use exists, by and large, is because the First Amendment, or otherwise free speech, which is recognized pretty much everywhere, is a balance on that, so that people can create and people can innovate, so that there is indeed a limited monopoly as set by law.
All right, amazing. In the short time that we have left here, we've got time for one last question for each of you. And, Nicholas here has a question with some framing. He asks, what are the most important skills or capabilities that security professionals need to leverage AI effectively and responsibly? So the last question related to that I will ask each of you, starting with Caroline, Sunil, and then we'll finish off with Lee, is what should security leaders be doing about AI now, next quarter, and next year? Caroline?
I think what I have been researching quite a lot on the security side is, I think security leaders should be thinking about generative AI specifically, because I think we're in a bit of a hype cycle. And I think having some guardrails put in place in the organizational level around the use of generative AI as it's evolving so quickly. There's a lot of tools being put out there that I would be very cautious about. But then I'd also think about it in terms of not just your internal policies, but also your third parties, and what type of integrations are being allowed into your own company's development cycle, if it's a technology company that does do some coding. And then I'd also look at some of the threat threats that may be coming down the pike. I think what I'm not as worried about the big threat of AI in security as some people are sending fear around the world about. But I do think right now, practically what's happening is there's an extreme amount of phishing happening because emails can now be written very, very well based on the use of this generative AI. So it's a very practical, small tidbit, but I think that is something that would be, as a security leader, you should be looking at for the big threat of 2023.
Great, thank you. Sunil.
Lots to unpack. So I think I put these concerns into three major categories. The securing the use of third-party AI, securing how we build AI systems, and then third, finding ways that we in security can actually use AI. And it's the third one that's actually the most interesting, because the first two, honestly, is not very different. Okay. The first one, the securing the use of AI, is not very, that's not very different in that we actually have tools like DLP, we have tools like CASB, there's new entrants like secure enterprise browsers that help us do some of these things. If there is anything different, it's just the span or the massive number of people who are wanting to use these things. And so, but the tools are there to help us manage this well. And as we looked at the policies around the use of these tools, turns out the controls that we have are generally kind of the same. There is a new set of tools that emerged that's kind of cool around like sanitization, but again, you know, we've had those type of things before. Securing the building of AI systems, there's a threat model that's out there that's really useful from the Berryville Institute of Machine Learning. If you haven't seen that, look at it, understand it. It'll really help you understand how to distill the FUD, a lot of the FUD that we see when it comes to what will happen if I use this, will somebody steal my data, and so on. Okay, and then the third one is where I think there's actually a lot of opportunity and a lot of interesting things emerging. And to be honest, it's actually not how do I defeat the attackers who are using ChatGPT to generate more interesting emails. Frankly, it's actually the people who click on emails are the ones who who don't see the poor grammar. So having better emails is nice, but someone can just write that anyway, and write a really interesting phishing email anyway, and still try to get us. I think, frankly, there's a lot of interesting things that are emerging in that space that are worth paying attention to, because that will help accelerate us as leaders to truly tap into this technology and to make it really work for us. But at the same time, there's going to be a lot of snake oil, and discerning what's snake oil and what's not is going to be the challenge. So being informed of that is going to be our thing. So now, one last thing that I want to throw in there is I mentioned the AI safety problem earlier. It's tied into something that's bigger than cybersecurity, much, much, much bigger, 10, 100 times bigger than a concern around cybersecurity, and it's called the alignment problem. And if you really wanted to understand where the future is going, understand the alignment problem and how we as cyber safety practitioners can contribute to that. If you're interested in understanding the alignment problem, there's a book recently released called Human Compatible that articulates the alignment problem and then provides some really interesting things that we in security can learn from it as well.
Great. Thank you, Sunil. All right. Lee, go ahead and take us out.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. So in terms of where we are today as CISOs and what companies are doing in terms of Fortune 500, 200, not-for-profits and others, I would say that we are walking before we could run in regard to AI for most of us. We are trying to read the tea leaves, so to speak, to decipher what is our company's appetite for this, what are the use cases for AI, how can we responsibly use this, and hopefully once we achieve that baseline understanding, we're also standing up policies as to where we are now with AI. But I would argue that policies should evolve as AI becomes much more pervasive, as the way we do work becomes much more pervasive. And notwithstanding that, of course, us being cyber people, we have to be very attuned to the new threats that AI is going to introduce, such as Caroline, I know that you were mentioning things relevant to AI threats, and what I've been seeing is that there's a lot more deepfake audio scams that are happening where people are being scammed out of money. Unfortunately, it's attacking consumers, but I assume that we will see that a lot more in terms of business email compromise as well, because it's relatively easy and quick to do compared to deepfake audio, which it would take me, for example, 24 hours to a week, depending upon how accurate I want that deepfake video to be, to train that model the way technology currently is, and in terms of how fast and powerful computers are with their GPU processing time, etc. But notwithstanding that, I would say the second segment where we are would be in terms of 6 months from now would be, let's information share, not just in terms of threats, but how we are using AI for our businesses, for our sectors, so that we can understand. Because what I have seen and what I've been unfortunately privy to is that unfortunately there are a lot of data leaks and breaches that are happening, not necessarily because of the fault of the technology, although on occasion that is, but more because people are copying and pasting at times very sensitive information en masse just because they haven't been trained, just because there isn't that policy. So that's why it's really important for us to understand how to intelligently and responsibly and safely use AI within 6 months from now. And then finally, for a year from now, it's, I think, apparent that AI will be integrated into productivity software and so many other applications, web browsers, other kinds of functionality. And I think then we'll be in the AI revolution where we really have to think in terms of business and technical risk, what is actually happening, and all throughout, threaded throughout in terms of what CISOs and other leaders should be thinking. I think that we would be amiss to not talk about economics and the economic impact of AI on our businesses, on our technology resources. Are we going to hire people? Are we going to fire people? Are we going to lay people off? Because the worst thing we could do as cybersecurity professionals or other leaders is not to give careful thought about the entire impact of what's happening. And that's why we need enterprise-wide committees that will essentially understand and review risk relevant to AI.
Great. Well, hey, thank you so much, Caroline, Sunil, and Lee, for the great discussion and all of your great comments. Thank you, guys.